Okay, hello everyone. I'm John Mobanzada, Executive Director of the MIT Mobility Initiative. Welcome to the Mobility Forum designed by the MMI. Jinhua is traveling outside the country today, so I'm filling in for him as host, and Bhuvan will be handling the audience Q&A today. We are delighted to welcome Professor Brian Taylor from UCLA to the Mobility Forum. We're going to explore how travel patterns have been evolving in our post-COVID world. Professor Taylor will present 2 decades of data from both the American Time Use Survey and the National Household Travel Survey to consider changes in in-home and out-of-home activities and travel over the past decades with a focus on post-pandemic trends. Many of these trends appear to be enduring, and if so, have profound implications for cities, their transportation systems, and socialization more broadly in the years ahead. Before I introduce Brian, just a reminder of the norms of this forum. We ask that you keep your camera on and your microphone off. And we ask that you contribute with a question, with a comment, with an idea, with a useful link. Put those all in the chat. We keep these chat files. We share them with our speakers. It's really useful, so please do engage. And to give Professor Taylor a sense of the audience, if you could, please type into the chat right now your organization, your local time, and your location, just so he has a sense of who we all are. So I'm going to put in MIT.
And by the way, I'm enjoying the local time indications. That's fun.
Yeah, we have some participants from Japan, from South Korea, from China. So kudos to them for staying up late. See Bogota, Santa Monica, UCL, Zurich, Cambridge, MTA, DC, Denver, Colorado, Vancouver, fabulous. Okay, so as you can see, Brian, it's quite a diverse mix. Let me introduce Brian Taylor, is Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs and a Research Fellow in the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA. He teaches courses on transportation, land use and urban form, public transit and shared mobility, transportation economics, finance, and policy. Professor Taylor studies travel behavior and transportation equity, finance, history, and politics. His recent research examines falling public transit ridership, public sector responses to new transportation technologies, the socioeconomic dimensions of travel behavior, the equity of increased local option sales taxes for transportation, the economic effects of traffic congestion, and transportation policy and equity implications of the pandemic. And that's where we're going to start today. So, Brian, with that, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to be here. Oops. Yes, here. I'm now going to share. We good?
It's coming up. Yep, there it is. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, in all of this sort of work, there are lots of other folks involved. I have a list of the people who are involved in these pieces of research. Two highlighted were involved in the second paper that I'll spend, second two papers I'll spend a little more time on. Here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So a lot of the early research on the pandemic focused on the pandemic itself and the dramatic travel changes. And the more recent focus has been on longer term effects on cities and travel. So what is going to endure and what was ephemeral. There's a lot of talk right now about the dramatic changes to central business districts and downtowns. The idea that this empty downtown and decline of office occupancy is a new normal. that's been the kind of the context. And the focus has really been on the rise of work from home. So if we look at changes in travel, the two really dramatic things are the significant drop in public transportation because of the large share of commuters that are carried in and out of central business districts, and then the significant rise of work from home, which, when I first started my career, we were talking about how telecommuting was going to dramatically change things. It had eased up from about 2% to maybe 6% of hours worked before the pandemic over the previous 30 years, and then of course jumped dramatically after that. So the talk now is a lot about what to do in reconfiguring office space downtown, whether you can convert office space to housing, whether we can, whether employers are going to start forcing more workers back to work, and what to do sort of in terms of planning for land uses of which the demand for offices is considerably declined. Nick Bloom at Stanford maintains data on this over time. This is from multiple data sources. And while things reached upwards of 60% in the depths of the pandemic in the first couple of months, the levels have risen from like 6 or 7% and are now at what he's described in the most recent paper, sort of pretty steady at about a quarter of hours worked are at home. And of course, that's quite significant. There's been other talks about this. What are the effects of in addition to stress associated with traffic, about the rise of stress from working from home, what's happening with productivity and all of that. And so all that attention on working from home post-pandemic is well founded. But commuting is less than 20% of all person trips and less than a quarter of all vehicle travel in the US. And so are there other things going on that might explain the changes in post-pandemic travel we've seen? Oops. So, what about travel more broadly? What's going on with that? There's certainly other things in the getting in the way here. And, what is the larger context of that? So I want to begin with the sidebar, and that is a little quiz, and the question is which of these is terribly disappointing? So A is that the Boston Celtics won the NBA Finals in 24 to pull one championship ahead of the Los Angeles Lakers, 18 titles to 17. The second is that the sample size of the 2022 National Household Travel Survey is much too small for most in-depth analyses, and it includes no confidential version with lat-long location identifiers. Or three, that the serviceable, albeit maudlin, Coda won the 2021 Best Picture Oscar just 2 years after the win by the sensational film The Parasite, and just 2 years before the spectacular film Oppenheimer. So you can get your votes in, but the answer, of course, is all of the above. These are all terribly disappointing things, and I'm going to focus a little bit on my conversion AAA. That was ABC. Sorry about that from slides. So with that as a background, let's look at some NHTS data anyway. So first, here is a look at each of the bars is the dark blue is 2001, light blue 2009, light yellow 2017, and gold 2022 NHTS. And these are age categories from 5 to 14 years on the left to 80 plus on the right. One thing we can see is that for those 60 and up, it does look as though, 70 and up, it does look as though travel distances have been edging up over time. For the rest of the population, it was not at all clear and maybe declining slightly across these surveys until 2022. And of course, you can see those big fat error bars there that say we're not that sure about the effect for most of them. The 30 to 59 group is a big one, which is why we have more certainty. But it's suggestive that that the average trip distance is going up. Now, if we then turn around and look at, we're going to group this into larger groups. So we have youth 15 to 29 on the left and middle-aged travelers on the right. And I'm doing that for a reason that I'll mention later. So that the daily VMT per driver in the US is down. And it's not just down in 2022. We can see a pretty consistent pattern over time of decline in daily vehicle miles of travel per driver in the US. Um, and then if we look at daily trips per capita, we kind of put these two together. We have trip distances going up, we have VMT per driver going down. The only thing that kept happening is that we're making fewer trips. And this is sort of astonishing. And frankly, when I saw this, I didn't believe it. The drops down are quite significant across the three previous surveys, but of course, enormously down in 2022. And part of that could be, well, was that still in the pandemic? Was it still an effect of that? Was it just a problem with the small sample size of the NHTS, and we just don't have a properly representative sample? Something is going on there, because that just seems like extraordinary drops. Attendance at school, mask mandates, hospitalizations, death rates. For example, the elevated death rates in the US really ran from mid-March 2020 to mid-March 22. That was the end of the Omicron variant. It was peaking at 2 or 3 times during the pandemic at 30,000 COVID deaths a week. It has not been effective. Vaccinations have made the disease dangerous. And so in terms of a dramatic public, if we look at trip purpose again out of the NHTS, and this has got a rate from 2001 on the left and 2022 on the right, we can see the breakdown on trip purposes kind of changing over time. This is shopping, errands, and medical trips, and this is for middle-aged adults in 2001. Here's what happened in 2022. If we look at for youth, we see that younger travelers made a smaller proportion of their trips for shopping, errands, and medical. That dropped even more in 2022. If we look at the overall trip making and the trips per day and the breakdown by trip type, we see some similar changes, but kind of more dramatic when we layer this over the drop in trips. So not only is a fewer share of trips being made for shopping, but the actual total number of trips, because trips are down quite a bit. And the same for youth, going very, very low. So, okay, so we have a change in composition, a change in the number of them. By comparison, if we look at commuting, we can see that that things are down as well, but they're not as significant as something outside of travel. So we're focusing a lot on commuting with the work from home, but in terms of shopping trips, they're down even more dramatically. One other thing I want to mention here from these data is that this list, the solid or darker part of the bar is made in a private vehicle, and the blue is for age 15 to 29. The gold is for age 30 to 59. And we can see that the share of private vehicle is dark, and then all other modes, which would be public transit, walking, biking, are listed here. We can see that there's more trips by means other than private automobile in the US by younger travelers, which we'd expect. But this being the US, the dominance of private vehicles is quite dramatic. When we compare that to what's going on in 2022, we can see, again, not only have the trips gone down, but there is a shift toward more trips being made in private automobiles. So we're having a modal shift in 2022 that we really didn't see in the intervening years. So what's behind all these changes? How can personal travel be down much more than vehicle travel? I didn't put this in here, but if we look at overall VMT, it rebounded pretty quickly and was remained depressed for a few years, but in most places, it's now within 90 to 110% of pre-pandemic levels. So in some places, VMT or vehicle miles of travel is higher than it was before. So how do we square all of this apparently dramatic change in personal travel to looking out on the highways and seeing that the traffic is down not much, if at all. And I'm starting work on this question next, kind of compositional analysis of what might be going on here. But some of the things is that, and I pointed out here, is that the fewer per capita person trips are tending to be longer distance trips, right? So part of that loss is being chewed up by people are making fewer out of home trips, but when they do, they're longer. The fewer per capita personal trips being made are more likely in motor vehicles. So we're shifting more into vehicle miles of travel, even though we're making fewer of them because we're now doing more of them or a higher proportion in motor vehicles. A third thing is that commercial travel has recovered much more than personal travel since the pandemic. And that may be accounting for that. And I showed you the shopping trips going down. A lot of that is being replaced by ordering from Amazon or other online retailers to having small truck deliveries, and so that could be shifting some of the personal and private VMT into commercial VMT. The timing and peaking of travel has changed dramatically over the pandemic. We did some work on this using streetlight data in Southern California, and observed really significant changes in not only the location and the direction of travel, but the timing of travel as well. Essentially, the peaks are getting flatter and longer. They're not quite as intense as they were before. And in Southern California, at least for the latest data we had, the peak hour of traffic in the afternoon has shifted from 5 to 6 p.m. to 3 to 4 p.m. So, and we have a paper out on that kind of looks into what some of the explanations for it is. So that's going on as well. So people may be observing traffic in places that they hadn't seen before or times they hadn't experienced, even if some of the peak might be milder. And then the US population during this period is up about 18%. So you have fewer people making trips per capita, but you have a larger population making trips overall. And so that can explain kind of overall VMT. Or it could be this that the 2022 NHDS is just too small to give us reliable information. It's more problematic than anything else, and that this may be a blip. So I guess what I'd suggest is let's look at another data source, and so that's what I'm going to do in the second half of this discussion. And there, we have a couple of papers out. Eric Morris is a former master's and PhD student at UCLA, who's now a professor at Clemson. Sam Sproney, who's one of my current PhD students, and we did two papers looking at the American Time Use Survey. The first entitled "Going Nowhere Fast," where we looked at travel between 2003, when the American Time Use Survey started collecting annual data, in 2019, in the second paper called "Going Nowhere Faster," which looks at 2019 to 2023 data. So a little bit about this. The American Time Use Survey is an annual survey of between 9,000 and 14,000 people in the US over age 14 on how they use their time on the prior day. All respondents also complete the current population survey as well. We focused on adults, people 18 or over, and their out-of-home or yard activities. So, mowing your lawn it doesn't count as leaving your home, but and excludes it doesn't include air travel if it occurred on that day. We modeled 12 out-of-home activities. The American Time Use Survey categorizes hundreds of activities, but we used some of their categories and changed some others. And so our 12 out-of-home activities covered about 97% of mean out-of-home time for the sample. We looked at 3 travel modes, and that covered about 99.2% of daily travel time. And remember, this is not about miles, or this is about the time spent traveling. And then 16 in-home categories that covered about 98.4% of the travel time. And so we separately modeled OLS models for each of these time use. I had in other work I'd done with Eric previously used Crag Hurdle models, but part of the argument for this, there's an interesting paper that Eric found that argued that OLS was actually more useful. This in part because on any given day, most people don't engage in most activities. So you could say it's kind of left censored at 0 and raises problems using OLS. But over the course of a year, most people do most of the activities. So it's really the nature of the sample and not that people don't do these things at all. And so and we used a suite of demographic and geographic control models and in the models, and part of the reason for that is so we can eliminate the possibility that the changes in time use we observe are due to underlying changes in the population, aging of the population, immigration, a variety of things that might be going on. So we're essentially controlling for the demographic and locational factors to try to be somewhat consistent across each of the years of the survey. And then the independent variables of interest were our survey dummy years, so in the pooled sample. So here first is a look at our at sort of our observed for any given year, and then the overall multi-year trend line in terms of predicted out-of-home time and predicted time spent traveling. Which I always want to be very clear that time traveling is very different than time travel, and that's for another sort of paper. So I won't talk about that. But the multi-year trend line, this is up to the pandemic, right? So we excluded everything in the pandemic, and the point of this is to show that actually before all of the permutations and disruptions of the pandemic, we were seeing pretty clear pattern of declining time spent outside of the home in the US and the declining time spent traveling over all of the years. And so it's a pretty unambiguous trend there. So by our estimates, that out-of-home activity time, excluding travel, dropped by an average of 38 daily minutes between 2003 and 2019. You'd say 38 minutes, is that a lot? Is it not a lot? This is over the entire population. This is a pretty dramatic shift of, well over a half hour over this time period inside the home. And daily time spent traveling fell about 7 minutes across this period. And of course, that's going to be complicated by whether there's more congestion over time, which during this period there was, but the actual time spent traveling was more, and it suggests that trips may be declining more than the time that someone says spends completing those trips. The increasing time we said was likely the result of better commuting and computing and communication technologies, and part of the reason for that is the sorts of time uses where we saw the most significant increases were games and gaming, and time spent streaming and watching TV, and the and other activities that involved ICT inside the home. But we can't say that necessarily caused it, but they certainly was associated with those kinds of activities. And while nearly all the demographic groups reduced their out-of-home activities leading up to the pandemic, it was young, single people who saw the sharpest drops. And this was pretty significant overall. I'm not going to show you a lot of graphs on this, but the one that caused me to gasp when I first saw it and speaks of pretty significant underlying factors is this one, which I'm going to move my the blue line here is people who have never married. The purple line is people who are divorced or separated. The yellow line are people who are widowed, and the orange line are people who are married. And we might assume that people who are married are more likely to to be happier ensconced at home and not going out as much. And we can see that the slopes are slightly different, but for the married, the widowed, and the divorced, things are pretty similar. But for people who were never married, they actually went from spending about 40 minutes a day or 35 minutes a day more outside the phone than, say, a married person. They were down to nearly the same amount of out-of-home time by 2019. This is a pretty dramatic change, and I think we speculated related to the very high levels of ICT use among younger adults, and also, and this gets out of our area of transportation, but the way that young people might be socializing and meeting one another has changed dramatically during this period. To result in these sort of extraordinary changes in time spent out of home. So that was before the pandemic. So what's happened since the pandemic? And what we found, and I think not surprisingly, is that if we were going nowhere fast before, we're going nowhere faster now. This shows essentially 4 time periods. 2019 is our pre-pandemic baseline. That's where we ended that previous set of data, right? So it was already kind of depressed over from 2003. What we describe as mid-pandemic, they had to, like many things, the ATS had to stop collecting data for a few months early in the pandemic in 2020. So we leave those data out. We can say that the 2021 is the early pre-pandemic sort of recovery period, but sort of somewhere between the pandemic and post-pandemic, and then 2022 is that, and then 2023 is pretty clearly after the pandemic, and a good 10 months after any of the public health effects on what's happening, and that this is mostly post-pandemic legacy. Sam, the PhD student, had this kind of clever way of doing this, is that each of those gray arrows represents a statistically significant change over the time period. What we can see is that out-of-home time went from about 334 minutes a day, and again, that was the depressed 2019 relative to 2003 time, to 271 minutes a day in the pandemic. And then the recovery in the 2 years following up through 2023 was about 10 minutes a day. So most of that decline in out-of-home time has remained. And then if we look at, and again, that's excluding travel. If we look at in-home time, and this is big because we include sleep here as well, right? So the time's much bigger, but it went from about 1,033 minutes a day up to about 1,112 minutes, and is now down to 1,099 minutes a day. So again, we can see that there is some decline, some increase in out-of-home time, but still not close to getting back to the pre-pandemic level. And here is a set of times that we can look at various different kinds of, in this case, this is travel. It's important to note that the scale on these changes, so the top group is up to 90 minutes. And so there we see travel increasing from, there we go, from 69 minutes down to 54 and back up to 57. For auto travel, from 63 down to 51, back to 54. Very similar pattern. We see recovery, but not nearly enough to make up that huge drop that we had between 2019 and 2021. The bottom scale is up to 10 minutes, and for those of you living in places like New York or Boston or San Francisco, this might seem a little startling, but in the US, most people travel by means other than public transit, and that across the entire population, we went from an average of 2.6 minutes per day on public transit. No individual traveler who travels on transit is going to do so for 2.6 minutes. It's just that most of the population is 0, and it's averaged over all those who are doing that, down to a minute a day in 2021, and then it recovered to 1.2 minutes in 2023. And indeed, if we compare this to data from the the National Transit Database or from the American Public Transit Association, we have recovery unevenly. Systems that carry more lower income riders tend to have recovered pretty close to pre-pandemic levels. Those that are comparing a lot of downtown commuters are really struggling. Commuter rail systems, BART in the San Francisco Bay Area is still below half of its pre-pandemic ridership. And then curiously, and I was a little startled by this, is that walking, which I felt like I was doing a lot of walking in 2020, but it also dropped significantly and has recovered only partially. So people are walking less than they did prior to the pandemic. And this is likely from the NHTS data due to the fact that people are driving for more trips. They're making longer trips and they're driving more for them. And then here are a few other that I want to show. This is at the top. I apologize for some of you if you have trouble reading the labels. It's squeezed a lot on here. And where I have the red arrows there, that is work, and that's inside the home on the left and outside the home on the right. So working inside the home went up dramatically and has dropped as we'd expect, but is still way above where it was in 2019. And work offsite or at a work site away from the home dropped dramatically and is up just a bit. A couple other I want to highlight. Eating out, it's interesting that a lot of the discussion about declining brick and mortar retail, the one thing that seems to be doing well in the US are restaurants. But we have a significant decline as well in time spent eating out from before the pandemic, and it has recovered only modestly. And eating inside the home has correspondingly increased and declined just a bit. And then here on socializing, this is time spent socializing with others. Out of home has dropped a lot. Going and meeting people at a bar, at a club, going, doing things with them, going to events together. But correspondingly, there's almost no change in the socializing in the home. So it just looks like people have stopped socializing. Again, we're transportation people here. We're not sociologists, but this is, I find this unsettling at the least to see data like this. And then finally, we're moving the scales down. These were, if you look, we're 60 minutes, 180 across the top, 60 minutes here. We're down to 30 minutes, so these are less frequent time uses. Information communication technologies for leisure. This is up dramatically and has, again, followed that pattern of slightly down, but not significant. And then time spent games, and games could be playing old-fashioned board games, but as well as gaming. And that's up and stayed up over time. So I guess my point with going through all this is to suggest it's not just about working from home. There's a lot of other things that have gone on in terms of the activities that people do outside the home that has changed. So we then modeled these, and Sam, one of the co-authors, kind of cleverly came up with a way of trying to graphically represent the result. Our paper, this one is in JAPA, and all the models are in the appendices. But here we have essentially several categories. One thing that I noticed we did is we sort of reversed this. Yes, so now out of home is on the left and in home is on the right. So we reversed it for which I was showing you. So, okay, so out of home and then travel times down the middle. So first are time uses that didn't really change a lot pre and post pandemic. So in terms of out of home activities, household maintenance, watching TV out of home, and exercising out of home didn't change much throughout the time period. In terms of in-home activities, the time people spend reading and socializing didn't change much. And actually, from the pandemic to now, at least into 2023, watching TV went down a little bit. So these are things where we didn't see a lot of changes pre and post. Here are things where we saw decreases in time uses. And what I want to point out is that we didn't see a single decrease in time use in in-home activities. all of the activities for which we had a decrease in time use were for out-of-home activities. And so we kind of put here things that went down and mostly bounced back, but not quite. Things that went down and then bounced back a little, and you saw examples of those, and the things that went down and stayed down. Okay, so those are those kind of three categories there. So caring for others, at time spent education out of home, so people going back to school, and live sports and entertainment, people going to see sporting events and things like that. Those have mostly, but not completely, bounced back. Things that have bounced back a little are time spent on religious activities and traveling in automobiles. Things that have kind of gone down and through 2023 and stayed down was time spent working out of home, eating and drinking in restaurants, things like that, socializing, shopping, volunteering, and then with respect to travel, riding transit or walking. And this is just a broad characterization. And then for things that time use is increased, I want you to notice that not a single out-of-home activity increased, and that all of them are in-home activities. Things that went way up and went mostly down, but not completely, would be education, exercise, and religion. Things that went up a lot and have gone down somewhat are time spent working in home and eating and drinking. Things that went up and stayed up are household maintenance, care for others in the home, relaxing hobbies, game playing, shopping, ICT use. And things that went up early in the pandemic and have continued to go up is time spent sleeping, which is interesting because in the US, Americans tended to sleep less than most other countries around the world. And we're moving out of the low sleep category and into the mid sleep category if you look at the literature. I think the lowest in the world now are Japan and South Korea in terms of average hours of sleep per night. So that's something that doesn't have an effect on travel, but it's certainly been changing. Okay, so if we go back to that graph that I showed at the outset, we can see that slope of the line has changed to account for what happened in 2023. That yellow line is the continuation of the projected trend from the 2003 to 2019 data that we showed before, right? And then now what we see is is sort of the actual time use. So this is the predicted and revealed out of home time. And you can see that it's plummeted from in 2003 about 365 minutes a day down to a little over 265 minutes a day, an absolutely stunning decline. Then it's recovered up to about 280, but pretty much stayed there at least through 2023. For a time spent traveling, we see something not quite as dramatic, but still significant, that time spent traveling has gone down significantly during the pandemic, and then coming out of it, it's recovered somewhat, but is still well below where it was pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so what if all this staying at home and making fewer trips is really good for the environment? Less traffic, fewer pollutant emissions, less respiratory illness, fewer GHG emissions. Yay! This could be really great. Though longer person trips and more commercial trips may undermine this. And if trips themselves, getting to destinations to engage in activities, if that's the raison d'etre of transportation, and what we're doing is we're actually just having more vehicle miles of travel to serve fewer trips over time, then we may be occasioning more environmental costs for fewer transportation benefits over time. And if this less personal travel is coming at other kinds of costs, so less socialization, less exposure to sunlight, more loneliness and depression, and this is being documented in many realms outside of transportation. And I would add more hostility toward people with different politics and preferences with whom we now rarely interact. Yikes. Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you so much for that. Really super interesting. I want to just start out with, maybe zooming out a little bit and looking at mobility as a whole and comparing your observations on more like surface mobility in the United States to air travel. And I don't know if your team has looked at this at all, but it seems like the data out of IATA and the UN World Tourism Organization would indicate that air travel, for the most part, has recovered post-COVID. So it's an interesting kind of distinction in what the numbers are showing. But have you done any work in comparing these data that we see in the United States to other countries, Europe, Japan, China, wherever? Has the team sort of
We have
have a
not,
sense?
but I know I'm seeing interesting stuff come out about that. I've actually reviewed a few papers that are finding somewhat similar. Of course, the level of auto use is much higher, but it just in terms of uh, the activity participation and the location of it is changing. And so but I haven't done any sort of comparative work on that. I don't know whether anyone in the audience has, but I have seen sort of anecdotal evidence that we're seeing some similar patterns in this regard. And I see some people maybe responding in the chat, but no, I haven't. Other than seeing a few papers from other places. I did see one paper come out, and I just don't remember the authors on Japan that found something similar.
Hey, John, could I come in on that point, John?
Yeah, sure. Yep, please, Sashi.
So Brian, by the way, I had seen your paper before today, so I was very fascinated with your paper. Lots of very interesting things. I'll make a very narrow point now, but I also want to make a broader point. So I haven't seen the research of this kind of depth from other places. We do quite a lot of work of a similar kind in the UK, looking at travel patterns, and I can tell you a little bit about what we have found. There are very similar patterns in the UK, by the way. But what we get is data from UITP on public transport usage around the world. And there's a very clear divide between sort of North America and UK is sort of at one end. Europe is sort of closer to the North America and UK end. But if you look at East Asia, South Asia, none of these dynamics are true over there. So, transport demand has been growing, recovering, they're on a completely different recovery path. So, to your question about, comparative data from other places in the world, that's been our observation, just looking at not as detailed, but more summarized data than what Brian has presented here. I had a broader point and a broad question for Brian, John, if I could. Can I pose that
Yeah,
now?
sure. Go ahead. And Shashi, by the way, you're just so everyone knows, you're with Transport for London, Chief Technology Officer.
Yeah. So Brian, I've been responsible for our revenue for the last 20 years. So I look after our demand, and the kind of analysis that you've done is absolute gravy for us because this is what we do all the time. So the one thing that's, in my view, you've given a very good descriptive analysis of what's happened. The question is, why has it happened, right? For us, that really matters. So we kind of probe that question very hard because looking at projecting our future demand is very important for us. The one thing that we found in the UK is that if you look at the income distribution patterns, there is a real dislocation, especially after 2008. So, anyone joining the workforce after 2008 has joined at a lower income level. Their salary progression has been lower. Many of the things that have been done to help the economy have ended up hurting them. The result is that it's very difficult to get good distributional data on household real sort of spending power. So you get that sort of economy-wide, you get them by income deciles and all that. But what you don't get is age profiles, age cohort profiles on those, not easily at least. There are some people in the UK who've been doing very interesting work on that. And what we have found is that actually it's the removal of spending power, especially from younger people, but not necessarily only from younger people, that is resulting in the biggest change. It's not the only deciding factor. I'm not trying to make that point that it's the only determining factor, but it looks to me from everything that we have seen that is the causative factor that's leading to this change in transport behavior. Now, I mean, frankly, what it tells us about what might happen in the future is dire. But so that was my statement to you. But My question to you was, have you looked at the economic factors behind what's driving this change in behavior? Because that wasn't in your paper, and so that was my question to you.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you, Sash.
we do control for income, and the one thing that I would point out, we did some work years ago looking at millennials and travel, um, and saw dramatic changes and much more sensitivity of younger travelers to changes in economic circumstances between 2008 and 2012, something like that, during the Great Recession. But if you notice the trend lines I showed, they were pretty consistent with, depending on the economic circumstances. They didn't seem to follow natural changes in economic activity, and we've had pretty significant growth and reductions in poverty right through the pandemic. So while the distribution of income has grown more unequal, the number of people living in poverty, at least up through the economic booms of the post-Great Recession in the US, and the significant income transfers that occurred during the pandemic actually reduced the number of very lower income folks. So we just tried to control for that in the analysis. So that's the best I could say. Is,
But if I'm interpreting your data correctly, Brian, and there were lots of pointers in this. If you look, I mean, all the lines are in the same direction. I get that they have all the similar slopes, but some slopes are higher. And if you look at the slopes for younger people in your data, that's higher. If you look at the never married, which is highly correlated with being younger, that was the steepest slope that I noticed in there. So we could have this debate. I don't want to hog all the time here, but I personally, everything that we have done, everything we have seen, seems to suggest that there is a change of behavior. We are trying to separate out from this sort of claim of the Netflix generation versus other things, and the other things. It looks to us, at least from the analysis we're doing, is that the economic factors are the dominant factors behind people's change in behavior.
Yeah. And Shasha, you mentioned spending, the decline of spending power, which of course, yes, that's a function of income, but it's also a function of prices and inflation. So it could be that this inflationary environment that we're living in many countries, has contributed to driving
But also,
down.
but John, it's not just the recent
Yeah.
inflation. If you look at inflation in house prices, which has been a real problem since 2008, where the sort of economies diverge between house prices and everything else, it takes away spending power from people who don't have houses, which is typically younger people.
Indeed. Excellent. Well, thank you for that contribution, Shashi. I want to get over to the Q&A from the audience. I'll turn it over to Bhuvan, but just to position this, there's quite a bit of activity in the chat, Brian, specifically about the methodology behind the NHTS. So, you might, if you have any sort of high level comments on your confidence in the NHTS data, why don't you express that now, and then we'll go over to Bhuvan for the chat question.
Well, I mean, part of the reason I have so little confidence in the 2022 version of the NHS on its own that I wouldn't have presented it without another source of data that was showing something similar.
Yes, indeed. Okay, fair enough. So it feels like, this is because you have the second survey, the ATUS, to corroborate those results. We're pretty confident this really is a thing. This is what's happening. People are staying home more, traveling less.
All right. A lot of questions, very active chat. So I'll just jump right into it. So one question from Professor Patricia Mokhtarian. She asked one on the role of non-response bias for these trends. It's been harder to sample people who are out of their home a lot. And, the interacting that with the overall decline in the survey response rates may account for some apparent decline in out-of-home time. So I'm
That's
just
a
wondering
super interesting point. That's really interesting. Yeah, because non-response bias is just it's a scourge in our field. And the idea that people who were, because I've certainly thought about non-response bias among single parents and other people who are time pressed, but the idea that just in general, as that would grow, that's a really interesting point. I guess I would ask Pat, do you think that that trend over time is enough to erode what we would observe or to completely account for it? I guess that would be
Yeah, my
a-
thought would be that it's maybe only part of the explanation and that it, might be interacting with the declining interest in responding to surveys, period. So, if it's only that people who are out of home more don't respond to surveys more, that's always been with us. So something has to have been happening to make it worse. And I don't know if that something else is only that there's this overall decline in responding to surveys or, what. And so again, I don't think it's the whole story, but I just always wonder how much of the story it is.
that's a really interesting observation. Yeah, I got to think about that. Thanks.
All right. Next question from Stephanie Pollard. So about, the overall trip duration and length has been increasing. So is this a function of people moving their homes to lower density places with worse access from where they're making these trips? And this could be driven by that whole discussion on affordability issues where, the house prices are going up much, much higher than income levels. Yeah, just if you all had any.
I would say yes. I think one of the things that we sort of missed in a lot of the in the last century, we did see a sort of a very consistent trend of declining incomes in central city residents, white flight, movement into suburbs, all the housing growth was in the suburbs, and that inner ring suburbs and central cities were struggling economically and to retain population. And that really began to turn around in the 1990s, where there was a lot of revival and popularity of those living in central city areas. And I think that got confused with the idea that somehow that meant that suburbs weren't continuing to grow. They were. And that the share of the population living in suburban areas and the suburbanization of lower income households, continued on, even in the midst of a revival of urban areas in many places. So over time, the share of people who live in places where most of the trips need practically made by automobile has continued to march on in the US, despite some encouraging sort of regeneration in urban areas. And so, yes, I would say that I do think that that's at play. The other thing, and that we're doing now, I think we've got a paper about to come out on this, is that the age at which people give up their license is getting later and later over time. And I think that there's other research suggesting that older adults, both that people are living longer and are healthier later, but also the costs of giving up driving are greater when you live in an outlying area, are encouraging older adults to continue driving, even if they have to limit their driving in other ways, avoiding bad weather, traveling at night. But you might have seen that trip distances, at least suggestive in the data, were that for older adults, they were increasing over time. So that I think that those things are at play regarding suburbanization of travel.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Professor K. Axhausen had a question on, you mentioned streetlight data as one part, you all use streetlight data. So we have a lot of other sources, private data sources such as Replica, Streetlight, and other Google GPS data sources that actually track the movement of people. The other thing is personal health tracker that actually tell you how much people have been biking, walking. So how much of your results did you validate using these other, privately available data sources, was one question, if you're actually seeing an increase or decrease in biking or walking or actual movement of people in the cities based on GPS or vehicle counts from Streetlight or Replica.
We have been using Streetlight data, and I have not used other data sources at INRIX and others that are out there at as much. We're finding them very useful for certain kinds of analyses, but not reliable for others. I don't want to launch at this late date into kind of a description of where their virtues and their vices lie, but I would say that sort of a mixed blessing. But for the kind of analysis that we did, that we published so far, we felt pretty confident and comfortable with that because we were able to validate it a little bit with other sources. But in terms of the question was using these data to validate what we did, this was a national sample. And so, no, we did not use any kind of traffic data because our focus was really on trip making and behavior, and not so much on what that meant for total travel on the transportation systems. So that's the best I can offer on that.
Could you give us some metrics on how large of an effect the drop in out-of-home shopping had versus a drop in out-of-home socializing? Never married people might be more likely to shop online unless the steep drop is still there after age is controlled for. So any thoughts on that?
So I have a thought on that. I'm not sure it answers the question, but one of the things that we observed is that not only does online shopping involve less travel, it appears to involve less time. So when I order, when I finally give up that inkjet printer and stop ordering printer cartridges constantly, but when I go, instead of going to an office supply store and walking up down the aisle and looking for the printer cartridge and getting it, I just repeat my previous order. It takes me under a minute to do the order. So there's evidence to suggest that it not only involves less time traveling, but less time overall. And it's certain kinds of things that involve less time. So that then frees up time for other activities. So yeah, and there is an age component to that, but you can see that younger folks were doing less shopping before. So part of that is where they are in this life cycle, but that's sort of changing over time.
Just a quick one, while we have 1 minute left. We didn't see any stats on biking. So just wondering if that was, there wasn't enough data for biking to be considered, or, yeah.
Is that by someone from outside the United States?
No, I mean, I myself am a biker, so I also like to ask.
No. It's just that biking, utilitarian biking is very, very small in the US. And as you can see, we did not include that. I don't believe, did we, Sam? And we still accounted for a huge share of overall trips. It's quite small.
Okay.
Brian, thank you so much. For those of you who are interested in this topic, as Bhuvan had indicated in the chat, in 2 weeks' time, March 14th, we will welcome back Professor Nick Bloom from Stanford University on the topic.
I showed some of his data.
What's that?
I showed some of his data earlier on. Yeah,
yes, indeed. Yeah. So he'll be joining us in 2 weeks. Topic is cities, transit, and the future of working from home. Next week on the Mobility Forum, we welcome Adam Grosser, who's founder and chairman of Up Partners, and a senior fellow at the MIT Mobility Initiative, who will be sharing just a fabulous report that his group puts out called the Moving World Report, which is published annually, and he'll be sharing the results of that latest one. So again, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. What a great talk.